Welcome back everybody to Cycling World, and before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like and jump into the comments, because what we just witnessed at the Giro de Italia was a complete mountain demolition from Jonas Vingegaard, one of those performances that completely changes the atmosphere of a Grand Tour and leaves the entire peloton wondering whether anybody is actually capable of matching the level of the Danish superstar once the real high mountains arrive. Because today, Vingegaard did not simply win a mountain stage on the Blockhaus, he delivered a brutal climbing exhibition that completely shattered the race and made it painfully obvious that right now he appears to be operating on a completely different level compared to the rest of the Giro contenders. And what made the performance even more impressive was the way he did it, because after the savage pace set by Sepp Kuss and the rest of Team Visma, Lease bike on the lower slopes of the climb, Vingegaard launched his attack with an acceleration so violent that almost every major GC rider immediately started losing contact one after another without any real possibility of responding. That does not mean nobody tried to fight, because Giulio Pellizzari once again showed incredible courage and personality in front of the Italian fans by trying to hold Vingegaard's wheel deep into the hardest section of the Blockhaus, pushing himself far beyond the limit in an attempt to resist the devastating pace of the Visma leader. And alongside Pellizzari, an outstanding Felix Gall also produced a spectacular climbing performance by staying relatively close to the Danish rider, while the rest of the GC field exploded behind them. But even with those huge efforts, the visual impression remained absolutely brutal. Vingegaard looked untouchable. And although Gall eventually crossed the line only 13 seconds behind after an incredible ride himself, today's stage left one feeling inside the Giro that is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Right now, Jonas Vingegaard simply does not seem to have a real rival in the Italian mountains. And what makes Jonas Vingegaard's performance on the Blockhaus even more impressive is the absolutely brutal context in which the entire stage unfolded, because this was not just another mountain day inside the Giro de Italia. This was a massive 245-kilometre war of attrition designed to slowly destroy the legs and energy reserves of the peloton before the decisive final climb even began. From the moment the flag dropped, the racing was already extremely aggressive because multiple riders immediately started attacking in an attempt to enter the breakaway of the day, while sprinters like Jonathan Milan used the chaotic opening phase to secure valuable intermediate sprint points before eventually sitting up once his objective had been completed. The breakaway eventually formed with several dangerous riders, while the peloton, initially controlled by the Bahrain team protecting race leader Afonso Eulalio, allowed the advantage to grow beyond 6 minutes during large sections of the stage. But despite the apparent calm inside the main group, the physical toll of the day was already becoming enormous, because the combination of brutal distance, cold temperatures, and consistently high speed was slowly draining the entire peloton hour after hour before the Blockhaus showdown had even started. And once the riders crossed beyond 5 hours of racing with average speeds still remaining extremely high, the atmosphere inside the bunch completely changed, because survival started becoming more important than tactics. That was exactly when Team Visma, Lease bike, took full control of the race. The Dutch team moved to the front and began imposing a savage tempo on the approach to the final climb, systematically destroying the peloton and eliminating domestiques one after another before the real selection even began. Soon after, major GC names such as Egan Bernal and Enric Mas started losing contact under the pressure of the Visma train, and by the time the breakaway was finally caught with just over 6 kilometres remaining, the stage had been perfectly prepared for the moment everyone inside the Giro had been waiting for, Jonas Vingegaard's attack. And after the brutal work done by Team Visma, Lease bike on the lower slopes of the Blockhaus had already reduced the GC group to only a handful of riders desperately trying to survive. The decisive moment of the entire stage finally arrived when Jonas Vingegaard launched the attack that completely destroyed the Giro de Italia and left the unmistakable impression that the Danish rider is currently operating on a completely different level from the rest of the field whenever the road turns truly brutal in the high mountains. The Visma leader accelerated immediately after an enormous pull from Sepp Kuss, and from the very first seconds of the attack, it became painfully obvious that almost nobody in the race possessed the climbing strength necessary to respond properly to the pace being imposed by Vingegaard on the steepest ramps of the Blockhaus. Still, 2 riders refused to surrender immediately and decided to fight directly against the Danish rider despite the enormous physical suffering already visible across the mountain. The first one was Giulio Pellizzari, who once again demonstrated extraordinary courage and personality in front of the Italian fans by trying to stay on Vingegaard's wheel deep into the hardest part of the climb, even while the race around him was collapsing completely. Alongside the young Italian talent, an exceptional Felix Gall also delivered one of the strongest rides of his season by becoming the only rider truly capable of limiting the damage against the devastating pace set by the Visma leader. But even with those massive efforts from Pellizzari and Gall, the visual impression on the mountain remained absolutely brutal because Vingegaard continued opening gaps almost effortlessly, while the rest of the GC contenders exploded one after another behind him. Eventually, Pellizzari completely cracked after spending several kilometres far above his limit, trying to resist the Danish rider, while Vingegaard turned the final part of the climb into a pure solo exhibition that confirmed one very clear feeling inside the Giro right now. At this moment, Jonas Vingegaard simply does not appear to have a real rival in the Italian mountains, and after the brutal demonstration delivered by Jonas Vingegaard on the Blockhaus, the feeling across the Giro de Italia is becoming increasingly obvious because right now there simply does not seem to be anybody inside this race truly capable of matching the Danish rider once he decides to accelerate seriously in the high mountains. The visual difference today was enormous, especially considering how quickly major GC contenders started losing contact the moment Vingegaard raised the pace after the devastating work done by Team Visma. Chasson, Lease bike, and even riders who produced excellent performances such as Giulio Pellizzari and Felix Gall still looked completely overmatched once the Danish rider truly opened the throttle on the steepest ramps of the climb. And that is exactly why so many people are now starting to ask the same question after watching this Blockhaus exhibition. Is Vingegaard really this dominant? Or is the Giro simply missing the only riders capable of seriously challenging him in the mountains? Because while the Danish rider currently looks untouchable in Italy, it is also true that several of the most dangerous climbers and biggest talents in world cycling are not racing this Giro at all. Most obviously, Tadej Pogacar is not here, and over the last few years, Pogacar has repeatedly proven that he is one of the very few riders on the planet capable of turning mountain stages into completely unpredictable wars against Vingegaard while matching him explosively on the hardest climbs in the world. But beyond Pogacar, there is also the growing emergence of Isaac del Toro, who continues developing into one of the most exciting young riders in professional cycling, and whose progression inside the elite is becoming more frightening with every passing month. And then there is also Paul Seixas, another incredibly talented young climber who is already beginning to surprise the peloton with the maturity and climbing level he is showing against far more experienced riders, which is exactly why the discussion around Vingegaard is becoming so fascinating right now, because inside the Giro he looks absolutely untouchable. But the real question is whether that same level of dominance would survive once the true monsters of the Tour de France arrive on the scene. And after a performance as devastating as the one we just witnessed on the Blockhaus, the feeling spreading across the Giro de Italia is that Jonas Vingegaard has just delivered the strongest psychological blow of the entire race to every remaining GC contender, because beyond the stage victory itself, and beyond the time gaps opened on the climb, what truly shocked the peloton was the terrifying ease with which the Danish rider completely shattered the race once he finally decided to attack seriously in the high mountains. Because Vingegaard did not simply win the stage, he projected absolute superiority over the rest of the Giro field, and inside a 3-week Grand Tour, that kind of dominance immediately changes the mentality of every rival still hoping to fight for the Maglia Rosa during the brutal mountain stages that are still waiting later in the race. And that is precisely why the fear inside the peloton is beginning to grow now, because if Vingegaard has already been capable of producing this level of destruction on the first truly massive summit finish of the Giro, many riders are starting to wonder what could happen during the final week once exhaustion fully destroys the legs of the remaining contenders and the hardest climbs of the race finally arrive. Because at this moment, the message sent by the Visma leader feels brutally clear to the rest of the Giro. Whenever Jonas Vingegaard decides to race at full intensity in the mountains, the entire peloton suffers behind him.